we've done a ton of videos on these two topics specifically. Nami getting Prometheus and Usopp getting a giant hammer. The ideas there were that Usopp would get a giant's hammer to be a full circle representation of the giant hammer that he has in his arsenal, always being a lie, but now it has come true and it's a real giant's hammer that he could wield. How he could wield it was that the hammer would actually be some sort of Zoan fruit user, because in the past with guys like Spandam, the rules with item Zoans seem to be kind of weird, and weight seems to be kind of a suggestion as opposed to a hard fact in reality. So in this way, the hammer would either be the user of some sort of squirrel fruit or a mythical squirrel fruit in the form of a Ratatoskr fruit. Of course, Ratatoskr is a squirrel from Norse mythology associated with the giant tree Yggdrasil, right? Okay, and then with Nami, her getting Prometheus, that was simply to compliment Zeus and how weather is usually symbolized in our real world with a sun and a cloud. But keeping all that in mind, I think the idea of Big Mom losing Prometheus is still on the table. But the more I thought about it, the more I came to the conclusion that wouldn't it be interesting if Usopp didn't get the hammer in the way I'm describing it, but he got Prometheus? Because the more I thought about it, you know who's really associated with the sun now, other than Luffy? Usopp is. Now, I know we like to joke in saying that Soki King is not Usopp and is somebody else, but bear with me here. Let's just say the Soki King mask belongs to Usopp and he assumes the role of Soki King, right? What does the Soki King mask look like? A sun, right? Isn't that weird? And then between himself and Nami, I would say he's more associated with fire than Nami is, even though she has the ability to produce heat. When you're talking about actual fire, Usopp has had a bunch of fire attacks associated with him for the longest time. Even in the present, after being a bit of a botanist and having his moveset completely overhauled by the Pop Greens, he still uses traditional ammo and his old fire attacks. Those are still a part of the kit. So he's always been associated with fire. Now, with that being said, it would make sense to me that he possibly could get Prometheus, because not only is Prometheus a big fireball, he's also a sun. Now, when you're talking about plants, where do plants get their nutrients from? From the sun through photosynthesis. So what I'm saying is that what if Usopp shoots out a pop green, right? The pop green forms. But then if he has Prometheus, and being a sun could strengthen the power of that pop green attack and make it way bigger or way stronger than it would be originally if Usopp just fired it out. That's what I'm thinking. Now, if we're going with the idea that a homie perhaps needs to embody something in order to be a possession of another person, even though they have full autonomy onto themselves, if that's a prerequisite, like how Zeus is now the Climactac, he's not just a cloud homie, he's an actual physical object, what could Prometheus inhabit? Well, seeing as how there are no real rules as to what a character that is a homie, such as Zeus and Prometheus, can inhabit, what if he just inhabits Usopp's old hammer? So in that way, if Usopp wants, he could still make a hammer out of hot air, seeing as how all the hammers in increasing size have just been balloons he's blown up. What if now, if Prometheus inhabits a hammer, he just makes a big fire hammer? So technically, nothing has changed. The light technically has not changed, but it has become deadly because now his hammer of hot air truly is a hammer of hot air that can kill, because he would have a giant fire hammer. And that way, with Prometheus's size-altering abilities, he really wouldn't weigh anything. He would just be bigger. And Usopp can sling him down like a giant hammer, or shoot him out like a giant hammer, because he has done hammer projectile attacks before, like in the fight between himself teaming up with Chopper against Mr. Four and Miss Merry Christmas. And that attack was called Sure Kill, Usopp Hammer Comet, or Usopp Hammer Shooting Star. Now, what's so interesting about that is all of Usopp's attacks, even into the present, are always called Star, which I find quite interesting, because technically in Prometheus being a sun, he is a star. When at rest, he literally is taking up the visage of a star. So he technically would be more thematic to Usopp than he would be to Nami. And if he is inhabiting a hammer, I could see him increasing the size of the hammer, seeing as how homies have some sort of latent magical properties to them. They aren't just the thing that the soul is inhabiting. They seem to change drastically based on how the soul develops. So perhaps if he does find himself weak and inhabits a hammer, the hammer would still have the properties of fire, but it would be a fire hammer. Not sure how that works exactly. When it comes to weird properties like mass and energy, I'm not sure how homies actually work, because you look at Zeus can still astral project out of the Climatac, which is technically his body, and become a cloud homie once again, and even become a body of lightning in the form of a shark sometimes. So I don't know. But then too, while still being the Climatac, he can turn the Climatac into an actual morning star, and that morning star has physical mass to it. It has weight, as it was able to hurt Ulti. So with that being said, the rules are pretty open, which is why I could believe if Usopp were to get a real giant hammer, I could see that hammer being Prometheus. Now, when it comes to Usopp's work hammer, the hammer he used to fix up the ship back in the day, as well as I guess the fake hammers as well, there are very interesting spiritual connotations attached to it. Not big ones, but there are interesting ones. Let's go through them real quick. However, before we talk about the hammer more, I think I need you to hammer that subscribe button and turn it a deadly gray, and then hammer the finger of that like button. And then if you can find it, give me a big star and hammer that hype button. It's very much appreciated. Thank you so much. But continuing, in Skypiea, specifically chapter 254, Usopp witnesses what would later be known to be called a Clobotter Man fixing the Mary. It restores the Mary back to what it looked like originally before the chicken effects used to get to Skypiea originally. But this is further explained later in Water 7 during chapter 351, in which Frankie tells us that a Clobotter Man is a sprite or a fairy characterized by wearing a raincoat and holding a wooden mallet that lives on ships that have truly been cared for by the crew. So it's a incarnation of the ship. The reason why this is so interesting is because this thing appears after Usopp has used a hammer to defeat two very powerful arc antagonists previously, one being Chu of the Arlong Pirates, and another being Mr. Four of Baroque Works. But then what's interesting about this further is that later in Thriller Bark, Usopp uses the fake hammer to defeat Perona. Of course, Perona is a ghost princess, as she has the power to summon ghosts and become a ghost thanks to the Hollow fruit. So the hammer has some sort of spiritual connection with her, as it technically was used to defeat her. What's so interesting about this too is that later on in the time skip, Usopp fights Trable and Sugar. Like a Cloboterman, Sugar looks like a child and is wearing a hood. And technically, Usopp uses the latest incarnation of the fake hammer in a fight against those two. But of course, he loses. However, he was fighting on the behalf of the dwarves, or Tontata. Tontata are often referred to as fairies, like the Cloboterman, by the people of Dressrosa. So what I'm saying is that the hammer has always had, especially after Skypiea, has always had a very spiritual connotation with Usopp, both figuratively and in some cases literally. So to heighten that further, I could see him having a hammer possessed with a spirit in Prometheus, and that is the final statement when it comes to hammers concerning Usopp, in which he finally gets a giant hammer as homies have the power to somehow, some way increase the size of the objects that they are possessing. And much like with Nami and Zeus, even when the hammer is gigantic, it should just be a normal weight to Usopp. Or in this case, it will be controlled by Prometheus, so the weight wouldn't even matter. So with that being said, I could see Usopp getting his work hammer possessed by Prometheus sometime in the future. Give me your thoughts and tell your friends about Polypede. What?